Welcome back to Old School Sports and another part of our tutorial series on Out of the Park Baseball 25. This one, admittedly, not a pure tutorial, but still should hopefully give you something to think about as far as contracts in Out of the Park Baseball 25. What we're going to focus on today is 20 of the best and worst contracts, in my opinion, in the game. The point of this is to identify some contracts that if you're playing as a team with the players with bad contracts, you really might want to work hard to try to get off the books. If you're playing on a team with the players with some of these better contracts, that could be a pretty interesting asset for your team going forward. But even more important than what those contracts are today, it's what you can think about trying to do with them in the future. If you are a team that has some decent prospects and some money to spend, maybe going after some of these players who are already major league ready, who are on very good contracts, is a attractive way to accelerate your team's competitiveness. And even with the bad contracts, I think it's pretty hard in OOTP to kind of pull what the Mets pulled off before the trade deadline last year when they were dealing away older, expensive players, Verlander, Scherzer, Robertson, and generally trying to get prospects in return, while in some cases retaining a good chunk of those contracts going forward in exchange for those prospects. If you've got ideas on how to really execute those kind of trades in OOTP, would love to hear them. I think generally you're probably going to need to be playing in commissioner mode to really make those types of trades happen. But the type of players that I'm going to be talking about in this episode with really good and really bad contracts are the ones that you could certainly get pretty creative with, depending on how you like to play in your OOTP 25 baseball universe. And we're going to divide my thoughts into, as I said, 20 of the worst and best contracts in OOTP 25. We're going to talk about 5 contracts that I think are among the worst right now, 5 contracts that could become really bad contracts in the future, 5 contracts that I think are the best value today, and then 5 contracts that I think have potential to be extremely valuable in the future. And to ensure that we are talking about things on a fair and level playing field, I've changed the scouting settings so we're looking at these players with 100% scouting accuracy for purposes of this tutorial. And we're going to start out with the 5 contracts that I think are among the worst in OOTP 25 right now. Those of you who have watched me play Yankees mini-series over the past couple of seasons won't be surprised to hear me mention Giancarlo Stanton's contract with the Yankees as one of the worst. He's going to be 35 years old shortly after the end of this season. He's fragile in terms of his injury proneness. You could argue that he maybe should be wrecked in terms of his injury proneness, and he may not be too far away from that. He still has pretty good power, but he is a poor defensive outfielder. I mentioned the proclivity towards injuries, and he is still a player who has potentially $143 million remaining over these last 5 years of his contract. Fortunately, there is a team option for 2028 if you retain him that you can get out of. But he is willing to consider a trade to a number of teams, at least here in this OOTP universe. So if you're really looking to dramatically change the Yankees roster, perhaps retaining part of this contract and getting a good chunk of Stanton's money off the books before he turns 35 or before he becomes wrecked physically or before perhaps his power starts to go is probably something to think about if you're going to be playing as the Bronx Bombers. And if you happen to be playing with a team that's not all that competitive right now, but does have some money to spend, Stanton is the type of guy where maybe you can do a derivative of what the Mets did last year. You're not going to want to take on all of Stanton's contract, most likely, but if you could get the Yankees to throw in a decent prospect or two with him and take him on board in some of his money for and giving up almost nothing on your end, that's perhaps the other angle that this tutorial may help you with if you're a team that's willing to take on some of these contracts and try to pick up some prospects in return for acquiring these less than optimal contract exposures. In this second contract that I think is really a bad one, it's probably going to be a bit more controversial. It's Jacob DeGrom with the Rangers, and he is another player who is fragile physically, another guy in his mid-30s. He's going to be 36 before he throws a pitch this year, most likely. He is making an insane amount of money, $175 million potentially on his contract, although similar to Stanton, there is a team option in the final year of the deal. But huge money, almost $40 million a year that you're on the hook for the next 4 seasons. The ratings of DeGrom in the game are still incredible. And honestly, when you look at his pitching stats, they're still exceptional. The issue is that over these last 4 seasons, he's only averaged about 10 or 11 games that he's played a year. He's never even reached 100 innings. He's out again. I mentioned fragile with his injury proneness, similar to Stanton. Would not shock me if he's wrecked going soon. So you're going to be on the hook through his late 30s for a lot of big money. If he is healthy and effective, it's not a horrible contract given that his skill set is so impressive. But if you only get 40 games started out of DeGrom over the next 4 seasons, it's a very expensive contract to have on the books. A third contract that I think is one of the worst in the game right now is Javi Bayz with the Detroit Tigers. Still a solid, more than solid, defensive shortstop in terms of his ratings, but he is a definitely below average offensive player at this point, not only in terms of his ratings, but in terms of the performance he's put up in recent seasons. He's well on the wrong side of 30, and the Tigers are due to pay him nearly $100 million over the next 4 seasons. A fourth contract that I really dislike right now is Anthony Rendon with the Angels, another player who's fragile and in his mid-30s. That's a common theme that you're going to see in a lot of these contracts that I don't like. We all know the story with Rendon. He has played very sporadically since he signed that big contract with the Angels. Unlike some of these other contracts, there's only 3 years left at this point, but $114 million over those 3 years is a major commitment for a player who is a below-average offensive player at this point and a solid, albeit unspectacular, defensive third baseman. Given the shorter nature of this contract, this is one that if you have a team that's got a little money right now, you're not really looking to compete for the next few years, maybe you try to take a chunk of Rendon's contract as well as a prospect or two back to bolster your farm system for when you're intending to compete maybe in 26, 27, 28. And for the final of the 5 contracts that I think are among the worst in OOTP 25, we go to the Colorado Rockies. They've got a couple candidates here with Kyle Freeland and Chris Bryant, but in my view, Bryant is the worst contract because it's longer and more money. 5 years, over $130 million for a player who is the definition of average offensively, still a competent defensive outfielder, but a lot of money for a guy who's been a pretty below-average offensive player over the last season plus. Did well in a small sample size in 2022, but a lot of money for 5 years for a guy who's going to be heading through his early to mid to late 30s over the course of that contract and is owed significant money and unlikely to live up to the dollars that he's getting paid. Coming up with this list of the 5 players that I mentioned was made a little easier when Steven Strasburg, who could have certainly been on the list, retired about a week ago from the Washington Nationals. And this is a quick start as of today. And you can see that Strasburg and that bad contract, likely will be viewed as one of the worst contracts in Major League history, is no longer on the books and no longer something for you to have to worry about if you're starting a new OOTP 25 game. And the next 5 contracts we're going to talk about are contracts that are ones that we think could turn into some of the potential worst contracts in OOTP 25 in the future. There's going to be a common theme here. These contracts are basically just going to be with big market teams with huge budgets that have been able to make 8, 10, 12-year kind of commitments to some of the top free agents in major leagues, and in many cases some of the top free agents in Major League history. I'm not saying that all of these contracts are going to turn out horribly, but these are certainly contracts that you're going to want to keep a close eye on as you're going through your sim and have a definite view on, because if some of these players underperform, start getting injured, get old a little early, these contracts could become major issues. First, heading back to the LA Angels, Mike Trout, fragile physically, heading into his mid-30s, still has a lot of very positive traits, excellent power, excellent eye, very good defensive center fielder. The main issue with him, and it has been for the past several years now, is just his health. If he's in the lineup and still productive, you're probably fine. But you've got him for a lot more years at $35 million a year, 7 years left on this contract, and it is certainly one that's going to take him through his late 30s. He's right now not willing to waive his no-trade clause. If the injuries keep piling up and or he gets less effective, that contract could be very difficult. And staying in the city of Angels, the Dodgers, another big market team, are going to be a team that's going to have multiple contracts that could go bad over the long term. We'll just talk about Otani because it's clearly the largest contract in Major League history. The ratings are still fine, but he is a guy who's going to be 30 just after the 4th of July. If he loses the ability to be a two-way player because he doesn't recover well from that Tommy John surgery, and or if he starts getting old early, the Dodgers are on the hook for a decade at this point at well over $40 million a year. They're certainly a team that can afford a bad contract or two, given the massive resources that they tend to have in Los Angeles, with the biggest budget in the game right now in the number 2 player payroll. Don't expect it would happen. Don't hope it would happen. But certainly, if that contract goes bad, it's going to leave a huge mark on the Dodgers' finances for the next decade. And we'll fly across the country to New York from Los Angeles. Francisco Lindor, still a very good defensive shortstop, great personality traits in the game, good speed, and a competent bat to go with durability, which is always nice when you've got a very good defensive player with a captain personality. But another guy where there's just a very long commitment. You can see $32 million a year up through 2031. If his bat drops off materially, it could start looking like a Javi Bayz type of contract, but with even bigger money and longer duration. And for those of you who think I wasn't being objective since I haven't brought any Yankees up yet on this second list, certainly recognize that Aaron Judge's contract could go back, and when you look at guys like Cole and Rodon, the Yankees, similar to a lot of these other big budget teams, have contracts that could go bad. Judge going to be 32 in just a couple of weeks, fragile already in terms of his injury proneness. Maybe heading for a position where you kind of have to use him more often than not at DH to try to keep him healthy, which is hard to do with Stanton's contract being on the Yankees, which I've already talked about. But Judge at $40 million a year for the better part of this next decade is certainly a contract that could go bad as well. And last but not least, another really long contract. And the Phillies are a team that's filled with these contracts between Aaron Nola, Bryce Harper, Trey Turner, of lots of big money commitments over an extended period of time to guys who are now in their 30s. If these guys all stay healthy and productive for the next 5, 6, 7 years, those could be excellent contracts for the Phillies. But if one of these guys gets old early, if one of them suffers some injury problems, it could put the Phillies in a difficult financial situation. We'll highlight Trey Turner is the fifth one that we think could be a really bad contract. And again, it's really more the duration. He kind of looks similar-ish to Lindor right now, not as good defensively, a little bit better in terms of the speed. The bat, they're different types of bats. I think you could argue either way which one is better or not. But Turner locked up for a decade at this point through the 2033 season at over $27 million a year. If he ends up getting old early, it's going to be a very difficult situation for the Philadelphia Phillies. Again, just to review, I'm not suggesting any of these contracts are horrible, and it's very conceivable that several of these contracts will end up being just fine, if not good contracts. But just by the nature of the number of years and the amount of money involved, these are some contracts that I think could be problematic going forward. San Diego Padres are another team that's positioned themselves similar to the Phillies with long-term commitments to Bogarts, Machado, Tatis Jr., although he's significantly younger. Things could get squirrely on them also, similar to some of these other big market teams that we've talked about. Raffy Devers, Sonny Gray, a couple other contracts that I don't love that didn't quite make my list of the 5 that I wanted to talk about in a little more detail here as potential problems going forward. But enough with the negativity. Now we're going to switch to 10 contracts that we really like. Not going to be 5 and 5 here, though. But we're going to talk about 4 contracts that we think are the best in OOTP 25 as of today. And then we're going to talk about 6 other contracts that have potential to be really good going forward. And those of you who are baseball front office aficionado types are not going to be shocked to find that 2 of the 4 contracts that I think are among the best in baseball today are with the Atlanta Braves. The contract with Ronald Acuna Jr. is potentially a great contract, $17 million a year for the next 5 years at this point for a player who is one of the premier offensive players in baseball, incredible speed, and more than competent defensively. A second contract on the Braves that is an excellent one already, in my opinion, is Michael Harris II. Dynamic defensive player, good speed, excellent offensive player, only 23 years old, coming off of 2 straight really good seasons to begin his career, and off to a flying start here in 2024 as well, and set to be making well under market rates for the next close to decade if he continues performing the way he has the first couple years of his career. And it's certainly legitimate at just 23 years old to expect that Harris's production going forward is going to be even better than what we've seen over the first couple of years of his career. and his ratings in OOTP certainly suggest that that could be the case, given that the OOTP scouts still see some significant potential upside for him in multiple offensive categories. Third contract that I really like today, not as much as those Braves contracts, is Luis Robert Jr. Not as long, and it's a bit more money than some of those contracts, but a excellent defensive center fielder with a well above average bat, including some potentially exceptional home run power. Again, not a long-term deal, but I like the fact that there's team optionality built in to the fourth year of this contract in case things did go bad. But at $12.5, $15, and $20 million a year for the next 3 seasons, likely in the prime of his career in the mid to late 20s, I think that the Robert Jr. contract is a really nice one for that White Sox franchise. And a fourth contract that I really like today is one that's not going to surprise those of you who have been watching our Seattle Mariners mini-series in OOTP 25. But J-Rod with the Mariners, another exceptional defensive outfielder, pretty proficient on the base paths, and a very interesting and productive bat that has potential to get much better. Another guy who's only 23 years old. This is an extremely long contract going through his age 33 season in 2034, but at $18 million a year and with some team optionality built in, this could end up being an incredible value for the Mariners. Does admittedly have some traits similar to some of those long contracts that I talked about that could get worse in the future. But J-Rod is 7, 8, 9, 10 years younger than some of the players in those other contracts that we talked about. So certainly no guarantees in anything with life, but I think that the Julio Rodriguez contract is one of the most valuable in all of the game, given his youth, the length of the contract, and the reasonable level of the contract if he produces the way that I think he can. And we'll finish up with 6 contracts that I think have potential to become very good contracts for the teams that have them. These players are definitely not as proven as the likes of Acuna Jr., Luis Robert, and even J-Rod and Michael Harris II. But if they perform as, most importantly, the people who rate the players at OOTP think they will perform, and likely the way that the teams that have signed the players to these contracts think they could perform, all 6 of these deals could become pretty interesting assets over the next several seasons. Probably the least interesting is Garrett Whitlock with the Red Sox, but I still think it's a contract that could end up looking really good. Off to an excellent start here in the 2024 season. Not rated exceptionally in the game, but he does have a contract that's also not huge money. And if Whitlock is able to kind of emerge as a solid number 2 or number 3 starter over his late 20s and into his early 30s, I think there's potential that this contract is a pretty decent bargain for the team that plays their home games in Fenway. Another contract that I think could become an excellent one is Corbin Carroll with the Arizona Diamondbacks. You'll see a similar theme. It looks like I like good hitting defensive center fielders with some speed, and Carroll at 23 years old certainly fits the bill there. Been up for close to a year and a half at this point, a very productive rookie season last year, which of course resulted in the NL Rookie of the Year award. Very reasonable numbers these next few years through his minimum and arbitration eligible seasons. And if he really ends up being one of the premier combination of superior offensive, defensive, and base running players in the game, even those $28 million a year figures in his late 20s into his age 30 season are not going to be problematic. Mentioned earlier that I don't like a few contracts on the Colorado Rockies. One that I do like is the young shortstop Ezequiel Tovar, potentially excellent defensively with a interesting bat, interesting speed on the base paths. Was a below average offensive player last year, but still put up a 1.4 WAR as a rookie. Just a couple weeks into this season, he's already put up half of that total, so it looks like he's continuing to get better. They're kind of following the Braves model in terms of trying to lock players up to very reasonable contracts early. $9 million a year through his 20s is certainly paying him more than he would be making for these next few seasons when he's at the major league minimum in his very early arbitration year or two, but could be a very nice bargain for the Rockies through the rest of his 20s. And they do have the team option with a bigger number for the final year of the contract. I love to see contracts where teams give themselves outs if things don't go as well as anticipated, and the Rockies certainly have done that with the way this one is structured as well. Hunter Green with the Reds is another contract that could become good, kind of a little more similar to the one we talked about with Whitlock in Boston. Not necessarily going to be a great contract, but again, if Green, similar to Whitlock, can become kind of a good solid number 2 or 3 starter, these numbers are not crazy at all. And if Green is perhaps able to reach the highest heights that have been projected for him at times, given that he's now still throwing in triple digits, and he really develops into a number 1 starter, it could be a very good contract over these next several years. A 5th contract of an interesting young player that could become very beneficial to the team going forward is the contract that 22-year-old Colt Keith has with the Detroit Tigers. A respectable defensive second baseman. I don't think he's great there, but I think he got this contract because of the potential for his bat. After splitting last year between AA Erie and AAA Toledo and doing very well at both levels. In the majors now, certainly struggling a bit in his first couple weeks in the majors, but not embarrassing himself by any stretch of the imagination. And you see he's listed as the number 25 prospect in baseball here in OOTP. Ratings suggest he can get better in the future. And the dollar amounts are $5 million or less through the end of this decade, and even into his late 20 and 30-year-old seasons in the 2030s. If he ends up being a very productive offensive player, think that the Colt Keith contract could be quite beneficial for the Tigers over the next decade or so. And last, but certainly not least, among the potential best contracts in OOTP 25 in baseball, this one shouldn't really surprise anybody given the way I've talked through some of the previous contracts, but Jackson Chio of the Milwaukee Brewers, a potential excellent defensive center fielder with really good speed and a bat that could be exceptional, number 2 prospect in baseball. Similar to what we saw with Colt Keith, split last year between AA and AAA, subsequently signed to a major league contract, and Chio, $128 million over the next decade. There is a team option at the end, takes him through his 20s, gives him complete financial security, and does have the potential, if Chio reaches the lofty expectations that we think he can, looking at his ratings, to be a very attractive contract for the Brewers while also giving Chio that financial security. So a win-win situation potentially, but a contract that could certainly help make the Milwaukee Brewers much more competitive over the next decade if they end up getting a bit of a bargain going forward with what they're paying for Chio, particularly once he starts getting into the higher arbitration years and some of the free agent years that are part of this contract. And that, my friends, is that 20 of the best and worst contracts in out of the park baseball. Things to consider trying to get out of if you take over certain teams, things that you could consider trying to take on your books if you take over certain teams, contracts that you may want to keep, contracts that you may want to trade away. A lot of options in here, and I think being cognizant of the financial aspects of the game and kind of knowing when you've got a player who might be a bargain and when you've also got a contract that might be a bit of a problem is important to know as you put a strategy together to hopefully dominate your OOTP gameplay for many years to come. Until our next tutorial, thanks so much for watching and hope you have a great day.